On July 10, 1943, a German panzer officer stood on a low ridge overlooking the Sicilian countryside and watched a column of Allied armor emerge from the morning haze. At first, he did not believe what he was seeing. The tanks were small, low to the ground, boxy. They did not resemble the heavy British Matildas encountered earlier in the war. They were not the long-barreled German panzers he commanded. They looked underarmed, underprotected, almost unfinished. Someone near him laughed. The officer reportedly made a note in his field journal that morning describing the vehicles as toy tanks. Not a technical term, but an expression of disbelief. He had faced British armor in North Africa, had studied Soviet designs on the Eastern Front, had read intelligence briefings about American production. This was not what he expected. The tank moving at the front of the column was an American M4A1 Sherman. At the time, the Sherman was already earning a reputation, not among its own crews, but among its enemies. German commanders mocked it for its height, for its thin armor, for its gasoline engine. Compared to the Tiger, it looked fragile. Compared to the Panzer IV, it looked crude. Compared to what German doctrine valued, firepower first, armor second, it appeared backward. And yet, by the end of that day, one of those puny tanks would absorb 14 direct hits from German anti-tank weapons and continue fighting. At the beginning of the war, that outcome would have been considered impossible. German armored doctrine in 1943 was built around clear assumptions. A tank that was small could not be well protected. A tank that was fast must be lightly armored. A tank that survived heavy fire had to be heavy itself. These assumptions had been reinforced by years of experience. French tanks in 1940 had been knocked out in minutes. Early British cruiser tanks had burned easily. Even Soviet T-34s, respected as they were vulnerable at close range. The Sherman seemed to violate none of those expectations. It was tall enough to be easily spotted. Its armor thickness on paper was unimpressive. Its main gun was inferior to German long-barreled weapons. German intelligence reports emphasized this repeatedly. The Sherman's frontal armor ranged between 50 and 63 millimeters depending on model. Its sides were thinner. Its silhouette was high. Its turret ring was a known weak point. Its ammunition storage was exposed. German crews were told plainly, engage Shermans confidently. The tank did not inspire fear. It inspired contempt. The American crews inside those tanks felt the difference immediately. Sherman crews were aware of the criticism. They heard it from British veterans, from captured documents, from battlefield rumors. They knew German gunners believed the tank was easy to kill. That knowledge mattered. Inside a Sherman, space was limited. 5 men worked in close proximity. The driver and assistant driver sat low in the hull. The gunner and loader worked the turret. The commander stood higher, exposed through the cupola. They trusted something German commanders did not account for. Not thickness, but design. The Sherman's armor was sloped more aggressively than it appeared at a distance. Angles mattered. Hits did not always strike square. Rounds deflected, energy dispersed. And perhaps most importantly, the tank was designed to keep moving even when damaged. The engine was accessible. Controls were redundant. Mechanical systems were simplified to be repaired quickly. The tank was not meant to be invincible. It was meant to survive. That distinction would matter later. The engagement that produced the 14 hits did not begin as a heroic stand. It began as a delay. American forces advancing inland from the beaches encountered German rearguard elements positioned along narrow roads and stone-walled fields. Anti-tank guns were in place carefully. Infantry supported them. The Germans intended to slow the advance, not stop it completely. The Sherman at the center of this story belonged to an armored unit tasked with probing ahead of infantry. The crew had been together for months. They had trained together in North Africa. They knew each other's habits. Their tank was already scarred, paint chipped, track links worn, weld seams visible beneath dust. It was not new. At 06:47, the first German round struck. A 75 anti-tank shell hit the Sherman's front glasses plate at an angle. The sound inside the tank was described later as a hammer blow, Loud, concussive, disorienting. The round did not penetrate. The tank shuddered but kept moving. Inside, the crew did not celebrate. They did not cheer, they checked gauges. The driver reported steering was intact. The commander scanned for muzzle flashes. The second hit came seconds later. This one struck the turret mantlet. Again, your German gunners adjusted. They had expected fire. Smoke, a stopped vehicle. Instead, the tank continued forward, its main gun firing back. By the time the fifth round struck, German confidence began to erode. This was not how the engagement was supposed to go. From the German perspective, the situation became increasingly uncomfortable. Anti-tank doctrine emphasized quick kills, first-round accuracy, target weak points, knock out the lead vehicle to block the road. But this tank did not stop. Shells impacted armor and deflected. Spall rattled the interior but did not incapacitate the crew. The tank's silhouette remained visible through smoke and dust. German commanders observed through binoculars. They saw hits, they saw sparks. They did not see results. The gun crew fired again. The seventh hit struck the side armor at close range. Still no penetration. By now, German gunners were no longer mocking. They were confused. Inside the Sherman, the situation was deteriorating but manageable. Paint burned. Weld seams cracked slightly. Vision blocks shattered. The turret ring became harder to rotate. The loader struggled with debris falling from the ceiling. But the gun still fired. The engine still ran. The radio still worked. The commander made a decision. They would not withdraw. If they turned now, they would expose weaker rear armor. If they stopped, they would become a stationary target. Movement was protection. The Sherman advanced slowly, deliberately firing at suspected gun positions. The eighth hit struck near the driver's hatch. The ninth hit the same area. The armor deformed but held. At this point, German gunners switched weapons. A heavier anti-tank gun was brought forward, one that had killed heavier tanks before. The commander overseeing the gun reportedly stated that the next hit would finish it. It did not. The 10th hit struck the turret again. The 11th hit struck the hull. The 12th hit struck the track assembly. The tank slowed but did not stop. German observers later wrote that the tank refused to die, not because it was invulnerable, but because it absorbed damage in ways they had not anticipated. Each hit removed capability, but not enough capability. That was the design philosophy German commanders had underestimated. By the 13th hit, the Sherman was barely functional. Smoke filled the interior. The turret rotation was sluggish. Vision was poor. The driver relied on shouted directions. The gunner fired using instinct more than optics. Still, the tank advanced. The 14th hit finally disabled the vehicle. The round did not penetrate the fighting compartment. It damaged the suspension enough to immobilize the tank. Only then did the crew evacuate. All 5 men survived. German commanders inspected the vehicle afterward. They counted the impact marks, measured armor deformation, examined failed penetrations. The number 14 was recorded in multiple reports. The tank had not been destroyed in the way doctrine predicted. It had been neutralized only after sustained fire. That distinction mattered. The Sherman was still mocked in briefings, but now it was mocked with caution. The destruction of the Sherman did not end the discussion. It began it. German officers did not gather around the disabled tank to celebrate. They gathered to understand what had gone wrong. The expectation had been simple repeated hits would quickly overwhelm a vehicle of that size. Instead, 14 rounds had been required to neutralize it. And even then, the crew had escaped alive. That result did not fit doctrine. The tank was examined carefully. Impact marks were numbered. Armor plates were measured. The angle of each strike was reconstructed. The conclusion, recorded reluctantly, was that the Sherman's armor had not been thicker than expected. It had simply been used differently. German anti-tank crews prided themselves on precision. Their weapons were effective. Their training was thorough. They knew where to aim. They knew how to kill tanks efficiently. And yet, this engagement suggested that efficiency depended on assumptions that were no longer safe. The Sherman's armor had absorbed energy through slope rather than thickness. Hits that should have penetrated instead deflected. Rounds that struck at shallow angles lost velocity. The tank's profile, mocked for its height, had forced gunners to aim higher than they preferred, increasing the likelihood of oblique impact. This was not a miracle, it was geometry. German reports acknowledged this indirectly. Phrases like unexpected resilience and ineffective penetration at standard engagement angles began appearing more frequently in unit logs. Still, skepticism remained. One tank surviving 14 hits could be dismissed as anomaly. Equipment tolerances varied. Ammunition quality fluctuated. Crews made mistakes under pressure. Doctrine was not rewritten because of one incident, but similar incidents followed. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Sicily and later Italy, German units encountered more Shermans. They continued to knock many of them out. The tank was not invincible. Penetration still occurred. Fires still happened. What changed was the timeline. Shermans did not always die on the first hit, or the second, or even the third. German crews noticed that Shermans often remained mobile after damage that would have disabled earlier Allied tanks. Tracks could be damaged without total immobilization. Engines could run despite partial destruction. Turrets could still fire even when rotation became difficult. This persistence created tactical problems. A tank that does not die immediately continues to draw fire. It forces gunners to stay exposed longer. It delays redeployment. It disrupts carefully planned kill zones. German commanders began issuing informal guidance. Fire until it stops. Do not assume confirmed destruction. That guidance slowed engagements. It consumed ammunition. It increased exposure. The Sherman, mocked for being small and lightly armored, was forcing heavier weapons to work harder. The crew of the 14-hit Sherman became a case study. They were questioned repeatedly, not about bravery, about procedure. What had they done differently? Had they angled the tank deliberately? Had they altered standard operating practices? Their answers were unremarkable. They had followed training. They had kept moving. They had not turned broadside. They had advanced instead of retreating. They had trusted the vehicle to absorb damage long enough to matter. That trust was not universal. Many Sherman crews still feared the tank's reputation. Stories of fires spread quickly. The nickname Ronson circulated, exaggerated by rumor and repetition. Crews learned to fear penetration more than immobilization. But what the 14-hit incident demonstrated was not immunity. It was margin. The Sherman gave crews time to react, time to maneuver, time to survive. German commanders had not factored time into their assessments. By late 1943, German intelligence summaries reflected a subtle shift in tone. Shermans were no longer described merely as inferior. They were described as numerous, persistent, and difficult to suppress quickly. That language mattered. German tank designs emphasized decisive engagement. Kill the enemy first. Move on. The Sherman disrupted that rhythm. A tank that absorbed hits forced German units into prolonged fights they could not afford. This was especially dangerous in Italy, where terrain constrained movement. Narrow roads, stone walls, limited fields of fire. A tank that refused to die blocked space and time simultaneously. German commanders began repositioning anti-tank guns to fire at closer ranges. This increased penetration probability, but also increased vulnerability to infantry and artillery. The Sherman's survivability was shaping the battlefield indirectly. The 14-hit tank itself did not return to service. It was recovered later by Allied forces, examined, and ultimately written off. Too damaged to repair efficiently. Its value lay in what it had demonstrated, not what it could still do. The crew was reassigned to another tank. They did not become famous. They did not receive medals specifically for surviving. Survival was not an award category, but their experience circulated quietly among armored units. Crews talked about angles, about movement, about not freezing when hit, about staying in the fight until the tank physically could not move. Those conversations mattered more than official briefings. German commanders responded unevenly. Some adapted quickly. They emphasized flanking shots, coordinated fire, targeting tracks first to immobilize before killing. Others dismissed the incidents as edge cases. That division mattered. On fronts where German units adapted, Sherman losses remained high but predictable. Where adaptation lagged, Sherman's caused disproportionate disruption despite being knocked out eventually. Survivability did not mean invulnerability. It meant influence. The psychological effect was subtle but real. German gunners who expected immediate results began doubting their weapons. They fired again to be sure. They exposed themselves longer. They hesitated before shifting targets. In combat, hesitation costs lives. Sherman crews sensed this. They reported that German fire often continued longer than necessary. That gunners stayed focused on a single tank instead of repositioning. That anti-tank crews sometimes fired until ammunition ran low rather than disengaging. The teeny tank was forcing errors. By early 1944, German armored commanders no longer mocked the Sherman openly. They criticized it in reports. They acknowledged its weaknesses. But mockery gave way to grudging respect for its ability to remain present under fire. One report summarized the issue bluntly. The American tank is not superior in armor or armament. Its strength lies in refusing to be removed from the battlefield quickly. That sentence captured the shift. The Sherman had not become a better tank overnight. German weapons had not become weaker. What changed was understanding. A tank does not need to be the strongest to matter. It needs to last long enough. The 14-hit incident became one data point among many. It did not rewrite doctrine. It did not inspire new German designs. It did not reverse the war. But it forced German commanders to reconsider what small meant in modern armored warfare. Small did not mean fragile, and mockery did not survive contact with repeated failure. By early 1944, German commanders were no longer asking whether the Sherman could be destroyed. They were asking how long it would take. That was a dangerous shift. German armored warfare doctrine had been built around speed of decision. Identify, engage, destroy, move. Every step depended on the assumption that enemy armor could be removed from the battlefield quickly if engaged correctly. The 14-hit Sherman had violated that assumption. Not by winning the engagement, but by refusing to end it. That refusal mattered more than destruction ever could. Reports from Italy, Normandy, and southern France began to show a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Shermans were often knocked out eventually, but not before absorbing multiple hits that delayed German units, exposed gun crews, and disrupted defensive timing. German anti-tank units did not complain about the Sherman's gun. They complained about its persistence. A tank that dies quickly is efficient to deal with. A tank that lingers is dangerous. German commanders began noticing that Sherman crews behaved differently from earlier Allied tank crews. They advanced under fire. They stayed in damaged vehicles longer. They trusted that a hit was not necessarily fatal. That trust changed the dynamic of engagements. The 14-hit tank became shorthand in staff discussions, even when not explicitly named. Officers referenced the American vehicle that required repeated fire. They cited cases where tanks had absorbed 3, 5, even 8 hits before being neutralized. German gunners were trained to disengage after a successful kill. But now they could not be certain when that moment had arrived. Smoke did not always mean fire. A stopped tank did not always mean abandonment. A damaged turret did not always mean silence. Shermans blurred the line between alive and dead. That ambiguity was costly. German frustration grew most acute in close terrain. In Italy, narrow valleys and stone villages limited maneuver. Anti-tank guns were often emplaced in forward positions with little room to withdraw. When a Sherman advanced into these zones and refused to stop, the gun crews faced a dilemma: continue firing and remain exposed, or disengage and allow the tank to pass. Neither option was ideal. The 14-hit incident demonstrated that even sustained fire might not yield immediate results. That forced German crews to stay in position longer than doctrine recommended. American infantry exploited this. As Shermans drew fire, infantry closed in. Anti-tank guns that should have fired once and relocated found themselves pinned by small arms fire, mortars, or artillery. The tank did not need to survive the battle. It only needed to survive long enough. German commanders attempted to compensate. Orders emphasized closer engagement ranges. Aim for side armor. Visible tracks first. Coordinate fire from multiple weapons simultaneously. These adaptations worked sometimes, but they required coordination under pressure. They demanded patience from gunners already under threat. They assumed ideal conditions rarely present in combat. The Sherman exploited that gap. Its design did not rely on perfect execution. It relied on tolerance for imperfection. The 14-hit Sherman was often cited as an extreme case, but German analysts noted that it was not unique in kind, only in degree. Other Shermans had absorbed fewer hits, but still disrupted operations disproportionately. One tank surviving 5 hits could delay an advance just as effectively as one surviving 14. What German doctrine struggled with was cumulative disruption. Each tank that refused to die immediately forced adjustments. Those adjustments compounded across units and engagements. The battlefield became slower, decisions became heavier, certainty eroded. German armored officers began revisiting assumptions they had taken for granted since 1939. They had believed that armor superiority meant dominance, that a heavier gun and thicker plate ensured control. The Sherman challenged that belief indirectly. It was not superior in firepower. It was not superior in armor. It was superior in availability. There were more of them. They were easier to repair. They returned to the battlefield faster. The 14-hit tank demonstrated the extreme end of that philosophy. It did not survive because it was strong. It survived because it was built to keep functioning while damaged. Inside the tank, survivability was not abstract. Crew reports from similar engagements describe a progression of degradation rather than sudden catastrophe. Vision deteriorated. Controls stiffened. Noise increased. Communication became harder, but the tank remained a weapon. German commanders had expected a binary outcome, alive or destroyed. The Sherman operated in shades of gray. That ambiguity favored the attacker. The psychological effect on German gunners was measurable. After-action reports increasingly mentioned firing. Until certainty was achieved, ammunition expenditure rose. Engagement times lengthened. German units that once prided themselves on efficiency found themselves locked into prolonged duels with vehicles they despised. Mockery gave way to irritation. Irritation gave way to respect. Not admiration, but caution. The 14-hit Sherman also exposed a cultural difference. German doctrine emphasized decisive technical superiority. American doctrine emphasized reliability, redundancy, and mass. The Sherman embodied that philosophy. It was not elegant, it was not intimidating, it was dependable. German commanders recognized this too late. By the time adaptations filtered through units, the operational environment had changed. Allied air superiority limited movement. Artillery dominance punished static positions. Infantry-tank cooperation improved steadily. The Sherman did not need to win tank duels consistently. It needed to be present. As the war progressed, German commanders stopped mocking the Sherman openly. They still criticized it. They still preferred their own designs. But the tone shifted from contempt to calculation. They no longer asked how weak it was. They asked how many hits it would take. That question alone marked a doctrinal failure. The 14-hit tank became symbolic not because of heroism, but because it illustrated a flaw in German assumptions. A small tank could survive. A light tank could endure. A mock design could impose cost. German commanders had prepared to fight superior machines. They had not prepared to fight persistent ones. The 14-hit Sherman did not become famous. It did not receive a name. It was not preserved for display. It was not used in propaganda films. It simply did its job. That, more than anything else, explains why the story faded from popular memory while its implications endured quietly. German commanders did not issue dramatic retractions. They did not announce that their assessments had been wrong. Military institutions rarely do. Instead, they adjusted language. They altered expectations. They changed how long they were willing to stay exposed to destroy a single vehicle. Those changes mattered more than public acknowledgement ever could. By mid-1944, German tactical guidance reflected a subtle but important evolution. Anti-tank units were warned not to assume immediate destruction. Tank kills had to be confirmed. Immobilization was no longer treated as success. Crews were instructed to expect continued resistance from vehicles that appeared disabled. Those instructions were not written because of one tank. They were written because that tank had revealed a pattern. The Sherman survivability forced German units to rethink engagement tempo. A fast kill allowed movement. A delayed kill demanded commitment. Commitment under Allied artillery and air superiority was dangerous. German commanders found themselves trapped between doctrine and reality. Their weapons were still effective. Their crews were still skilled, but the environment no longer rewarded prolonged exposure. The Sherman exploited that gap. It absorbed attention, it absorbed fire, it absorbed time. Even when destroyed, it had already done damage. The crew of the 14 hit Sherman returned to service in another vehicle. They did not describe their experience in dramatic terms. They spoke about noise, about shock, about the difficulty of communicating after repeated impacts. They spoke about trusting the tank to keep moving, because stopping felt worse than advancing. They did not describe invulnerability. They described endurance. That distinction mattered. Survivability did not mean protection from harm. It meant delaying harm long enough to influence the fight. German commanders had underestimated that influence. After the war, German officers writing memoirs rarely mentioned the Sherman favorably. They still criticized its gun, its silhouette, its armor thickness. But the language softened. They described it as persistent, as difficult to suppress quickly, as numerous and resilient. Those words replaced mockery. The 14 hit tank had helped force that change. American analysts reviewing combat data after the war reached conclusions that aligned quietly with what German commanders had learned under fire. The Sherman was not designed to win tank duels through superiority. It was designed to function within a system: infantry support, artillery, air power, logistics. Within that system, survivability mattered more than dominance. A tank that could take hits without catastrophic failure kept crews alive. Crews that lived fought again. Units that retained crews improved over time. The 14 hit Sherman demonstrated that philosophy in its most extreme form. It was not exceptional because it survived. It was exceptional because it survived long enough. German armored doctrine had evolved in an era when decisive engagements determined outcomes quickly. Blitzkrieg depended on rapid collapse. The Sherman disrupted that rhythm not through strength, but through refusal. It refused to stop when hit. It refused to conform to expectations. It refused to die on schedule. German commanders had mocked it because it looked small. They stopped mocking it because it behaved differently. The tank itself was eventually scrapped. Its steel recycled, its tracks removed, its hull cut apart. Nothing physical remains. What remains is the lesson. A weapon does not need to be the best to matter. It needs to endure. The 14 hit Sherman did not change the war, but it exposed a misunderstanding that mattered at scale. German commanders had prepared to fight stronger machines. They had not prepared to fight machines that stayed. History often remembers firepower, it remembers speed, it remembers size, it rarely remembers persistence. But on a summer morning in Sicily, a tank that looked too small to matter absorbed 14 direct hits and forced experienced German officers to reconsider what survivability really meant. They stopped laughing, and that was enough.